Welcome back to Painting and Decorating. Now, I've been getting a lot of comments asking what water-based satinwood I prefer to use. Now, I've used quite a lot and some are very difficult to use. They dry too quickly, they flash, and the opacity of them isn't very good. So one of the best ones I've found is Valspar. It's my go-to satinwood. I really do like it. So what I'll do is I'll show you the system I generally use when I'm using my satinwood, and some of the process actually you can use before you put your gloss, water-based gloss on. So let's have a quick look. For this demonstration, I've got these tops of newel posts. So I'm going to use these. They're quite mucky actually. So any woodwork generally needs a wash down. Now that might be removing dirt or grease. Now if it's just dirt, it's not too bad. Like on these, it is literally just dirt. So I can just give it a wipe over and it takes it off. I'm going to give these a clean off. But you always have to do this because it's that contamination of your next coat. Even if you're going to sand it, it won't sand the dirt off, it'll just scratch it and leave half the dirt on. So I'll give these both a wipe off. Now if you was doing a handrail or doors where you've got a bit of grease, now warm water and soap usually won't get rid of heavy grease marks. So what I usually use is white spirit. That really does bring grease off. There is quite a lot of stuff on the market that you can use to remove the grease. But that's one of my favourites. It's always in my box, that's another thing. I've got it with me in my tool kit. Right. Now just while they're drying off, we'll talk about knots. If you've got knots on your wood, then really you want to put a knotting solution on it. This bin primer, it does say it goes over knots, but I've found sometimes it can bleed through that. So what I prefer to do is put a couple of coats of the knotting solution on, and then sometimes just one coat of that or two coats of this, just spot priming the knots. And then when all that's dry, you have to undercoat over that. And I like to use Armstead. This is quick dry wood primer and undercoat. It's good stuff. The opacity on that is really good and it's quick drying. So again, if you've got knots and you touch the knots up, you better turn using the undercoat first before you put any top coats on. Now satinwood, we call it self undercoating, which generally means two coats of that on clean woodwork and it's okay, you've no problems. If you was putting gloss on, you have to put an undercoat on before you gloss. Now if you've got dark woodwork, you're not going to get away with just two coats of this satinwood. So what you're better off doing is using undercoat first, because this has got a greater opacity and it's got more grip than your satinwood or your gloss. So like I say, if you've got dark woodwork, use the undercoat first, then two coats of your satinwood, or two coats of undercoat and then your water-based gloss, and you'll usually find the opacity is not too bad. Right, these are drying off now. when it comes to sanding your woodwork, you've got to be really careful that you're not just polishing, because some of these sandpapers that are smooth, they'd actually just will polish your surface, so then your undercoat or your satin wood hasn't got a proper grip. Now, what I tend to do is use a nice piece of sandpaper and make sure this is on fresh when you're putting 2 coats on, and give it a nice sand. Now, you're not using something too rough, but you're actually scoring the surface slightly, not polishing it. So make sure you give all the surface a good sand over. And then when you've sanded anything, you always dust it off. And you can use a tack cloth, or you can use a damp cloth, wipe it off again, allow it to dry. So, now, there's no need for me to put any undercoat on that because it's nice and clean. There's no need for me to put any knotting on there because there's no knots. So we can discount all that lot. So go straight on to my go-to water-based satin, which is the Valspar. Now, any paint, you've got to stir it up and make sure it's well stirred up. Some paints you have to stir them as you're using them as well, just to keep the right consistency. So I'll open that and stir it up. We're ready to put some paint on this now. You can use synthetic brushes, or you can use pure bristle brushes. Some paints are really difficult to use with pure bristle brushes. It's a mouthful. And then some paints are really hard to use with synthetic brushes. So you've got to make a choice dependent on your paint. Now, Valspar, you've got to paint quite quickly with it, and you've got to get your brush marks all going the right way quite quickly. You can't leave it to dry with your brush marks in the wrong way. See? Now the opacity on this is brilliant. I can't believe it, to be honest, for water-based paint. Ooh. Bit of an awkward thing to paint this as well, because it's got all the edges. So if it's a flat surface, you always find it's very easy to paint, no problem. And then when you start getting to edges, the paint doesn't really like it. Well, let's just have a look at the difference there. I don't know if the camera's picking that up very well. The opacity on that is brilliant. You know, it's not the light. So I'm going to allow that to dry now, and that'll only take about 20 minutes, something like that, and then it's recoatable. Just stick that down there. Right, we'll come back to that in 20 minutes, and I'm going to wash my brush out because you don't want your brush to dry in the meantime, or pop it in some water. So the first coat's dry. With undercoat or satin wood, you're always best to sand between coats. We call it denibbing. Now I'm only going to use a very fine pad, because all you're doing is denibbing. Because the paint is fresh, it's still quite grippy. So you're not sanding to give it a key as such, you're more sanding just to denib. The opacity for one coat, that's pretty good. Now then, so we're on for the second coat now. The only problem with water-based paint is mould. So usually what I do with this stuff is I'll add some mould inhibitor additive to the paint, which really does make a difference in certain rooms. Now we're on for the second coat now. Always make sure your brush is well worked into your paint. It's dried really well, that has. Now when you're using water-based paint, it's like emulsion. When you put a coat on, sometimes what happens, it starts drying that fast that it actually looks like it's grinning and not actually covering. But sometimes that's just because it's drying so fast, and you get dark patches and light patches. As soon as it starts to dry on the background, it slightly goes dark to where it's wet. Now that can be confusing at times because it actually looks like it's not covering, but if you leave it and allow it to dry fully, what you find is they disappear. It's a bit like silk emulsion. Oh, there you go. I'm going to leave it at that. That's pretty good. I don't know how the camera's picking that up, but I'll put it down here. Zoom in. Bring it back a bit. Not bad at all. Really good paint. So, hope you enjoyed that video, and we'll see you in the next one.